Hello, everybody, and welcome to Mrs. G's Storytime. We are reading the book Twice Freed by Patricia Sangen with permission of Christian Focus Publication, and we are on Chapter 14. Time passed and the boys grew, one in strength and physical beauty, the other in maturity and wisdom. Archippus was now 17 and would never attain his full height, and would always drag his twisted body about with the help of a crutch. But during his father's frequent absences, he had proved himself to be an able overseer of the farm and a kind, just master of men. His slaves loved and obeyed him, and seldom took advantage of his weakness. But the one whose friendships he coveted above all the others did not love him. Onesimus respected his young master, served him meticulously, but he never spoke to him, unless he was obliged to do so, and never remained in his presence a moment longer than was necessary. Onesimus said to Archippus one night as his slave was clearing away the evening meal, "I'm going to Laodicea tomorrow. Will you prepare my clothes for the journey?" "Yes, master," replied Onesimus. He carried away the vessels and returned, and began to lay out the clean tunic and brush the sandals in silence, with the utmost defiance. He had grown to the manhood's height now, but still moved with the grace of an athletic boy, and Archippus sat watching him miserably. The beauty, the rippling muscles, the proud, lifted head always woke him in an unconquered ache of longing to be like him, longing to communicate. 2 years had passed since they had sat side by side on the flour sack, but never again had the barrier been lifted. Onesimus was his slave, soft-footed, obedient, irreproachable in his duty. And beyond the mask of servility, Archippus might never trespass. "Would you have me attend on you tomorrow, sir?" Onesimus stood in front of him, hands clasped, head slightly bowed, a chattel without an apparent desire of his own. Archippus could have screamed. "Do you want to come?" he asked, in a voice half pleading and half exasperated. "Your wishes are my wishes, master," replied the boy automatically. He recognized the pleading and half enjoyed the game, for it gave him a strange sense of power. But tonight he wondered whether it was worth it. He would have given much to have gone to Laodicea. It was over 2 years since he had seen her. She would be a child no longer. He tried to imagine her taller, developed in figure, and he decided, with a rush of longing, to drop the mask. He looked suddenly, but it was too late. "Oh, very well," Archippus said wearily. "If it does not matter to you either way, you had better stay and help with the sheep shearing. There is a gathering of the Christians in the church of Laodicea, and some of the Christian slaves will be coming with me in any case. I shall be meeting my father and Ephorus, who are traveling down from Philadelphia tomorrow, and we will all return together. Be sure my father's appointment is ready before the evening. Good night." He turned away, and there was nothing Onesimus could do but to reply respectfully and go. Outside in the meadow he cursed himself bitterly for a proud fool. He was half tempted to humble himself and creep back and kneel at his master's feet and ask to go with him. Although he had never asked anything of Archippus, he knew that he would deny him nothing. He hesitated, turned, and then turned back scowling. Was this how he wished to face her, meek, servile, in the background? 1,000 times no. He would go to her alone, walking as a free man with his head high, or he would not go at all. He picked up a boulder and threw it spinning towards the valley and cursed again. Then he went home and counted his hoard of coins. It had grown considerably heavier by now, and tomorrow, with Archippus and Philemon safely out of the house, it might even grow a little heavier still. He had been so careful, willing to go slowly, but he had never yet failed. He had become so trusted. He sheared the sheep and went about his other duties absent-mindedly next day, for his thoughts were with Archippus and Laodicea. What was he doing, he wondered? Probably he was singing those same old hymns in some airless inner chamber, wedged in with a lot of sweating slaves and fat Jews. However, perhaps not. The church at Laodicea was renowned for its prosperity and independence, and seemed to have escaped any persecution so far. So perhaps they could hold their meetings comfortably and openly. He did not know, he did not care, and he wondered, for the 100th time, whether Archippus would see her. Probably not, as Polemon would hardly allow her to go near a Christian gathering. But one never knew. He suddenly wished he had gone after all, if only to have walked the streets where her little feet trod, and to have looked on the scenes that her eyes saw daily. The day drew on, and he saw them returning, far away, earlier than he had supposed possible. A tired little procession climbing between the green wheat fields, Archippus mounted on a horse and his father walking beside. These long rides on horseback always brought on attacks of pain, and Onesimus ran to the house to prepare the master's couch, and to fill the jugs with water, and to lay out clean clothing. He was just in time to reach the door and help Archippus alight. "All is right, master," said Onesimus, hoping to support the twisted figure which drooped with weariness. "Shall I help you to bathe and robe before your evening meal?" "No, thank you," said Archippus. "Hand me my crutch, and I'll see myself." "You need not wait, Onesimus. Good night." With an effort he drew away, his face averted, limped into the house alone, unnoticed by his parents, who were busy greeting each other. His slave stood watching him for a moment, and then shrugged his shoulders and turned away. "If he likes to struggle with jugs far too heavy for him, let him," he muttered. But he was bitterly hurt and disappointed. He had missed his master more than he had realized, and had been longing to hear what had happened in Laodicea. He wandered moodily over to his hut, and his mother cooked his supper, but it did not cheer him. The very sight of his mother worried him these days. She had grown so thin and coughed so often, and sometimes he noticed her holding her side, her face puckered with suffering. She was often asleep when he came home at night, but she seemed restless in her dreams and often cried out as though in pain. Yet when he asked her about it, she would laugh and tell him that all was well. "I'm in Christ's hands," she would say simply. "Can any evil befall me?" "Well, I suppose you can be taken sick and die in Christ's hand the same as anywhere else, can't you?" he had answered rudely, and gone off before she had time to reply. He took a few mouthfuls of food and then pushed the plate away and went out. He thought he would betake himself and this demon of restlessness within him to the canyons and climb until the darkness fell. Even as he strolled across the upper meadows, the quietness and the scent of the newly mown hay soothed him, and he walked more slowly and then stood still. He sometimes imagined that these long, light summer evenings you could hear sounds too small for ordinary ears. The rustling of the couch grass, the fall of the dew, the folding of the poppy petals, and the flight of the homing birds. His gaze came to rest on the shadowed town across the valley, where perhaps she was kneeling by some open window, robed for sleep, looking out on the evening sky. He wondered where her bedroom was and whether she had ever cupped her face in her hands and gazed over at Colossae. And then suddenly he was jerked back to reality by a sound that was not imaginary, but clear and very close at hand, a sound of a deep groan. He peeped cautiously around the outcrop of rock from behind which the sound came, curious but unwilling to become involved in other people's troubles. But instead of seeing and creeping away, he stood rooted to the spot. Pride and pity, fear, curiosity, all struggling for the mastery. For Archippus sat on the ground, his face hidden in his hands, weeping. Archippus, who had never once, since his talk with Paul on the shore, spoken of his suffering or complained of his lot. Archippus, who for 2 years had shown a brave, smiling face to the world and was sobbing like a child. Onesimus stepped forward. He feared the light and peace that dwelt in Archippus, but there was darkness and conflict, such as he himself knew. He laid his hand on his master's shoulder, and the boy startled violently and looked up, angry and ashamed at having been discovered by his slave in this moment of weakness. "Leave me," he ordered, but Onesimus, for the first time in his life, openly disobeyed him. Archippus, looking up wonderingly into his eyes, saw not the perfect, impersonal slave, but the boy had grown up with, gazing at him with deep concern and pity. Dashing the tears from his eyes, he pulled Onesimus down on the grass beside him. "What's the matter, master?" asked Onesimus. "Did anything go wrong in Laodicea?" Archippus gave a shamed little laugh and blew his nose hard. "Nothing but what I might have expected," he replied. "I've never told you, Onesimus. I've never told you anything, because you will not let me tell you. But I have always loved her. Ever since the day you found her in the canyons, hardly a day has passed that I have not thought on her. In a way I knew. But in my dreams it's difficult to remember what an ugly, weak creature I am. Only today she saw me for the first time since it happened, and now I know I need not dream any more." "What did she say?" "Oh, not much. She is still a child in some ways, and I met her in the street, and she would have passed me by, only I dared to stop and greet her. When she recognized me, she could not mask her horror and concern. She concealed it quickly and asked after my father and you, Onesimus, but she did not want to linger. She bade me farewell as soon as she decently could, and I know now that it was a farewell forever." He spoke sadly and quietly, as though his passionate grief had died in the telling. They sat for a few minutes in silence, and then Archippus spoke again haughtily. "I went on into the church, and we started with a great love feast, and food, and drink, and profusion. All seemed satisfied, patronizing, lukewarm. I was like a man starving for living bread and water. Perhaps it was not Christ I was seeking. I wanted her, Onesimus, or failing her, some human comfort and solace. He knew. He is very merciful towards our weakness." "What do you mean, master?" "Oh, drop that, master, can't you? I loathe that master-slave relationship. We were babies together, Onesimus, and you were my friend years before you were my slave. And Christ was merciful. I needed him, but he touched me in a human hand, with a human hand, and spoke to me through human lips. You came." "Me?" repeated Onesimus, thoroughly alarmed at the new part he seemed to have played. "Yes, you. You have not spoken to me like that for 2 years, and I want to know now, Onesimus, why you put up with these barriers and act like a dead dummy. Is it because I ill-treated you before I knew Christ? Heaven knows how I have repented of my pride and cruelty and deceit. Will you never forgive me?" It was getting dark now, and a sickly moon had risen over the poplars. Deep called to deep, truth to truth. "It's not that," said Onesimus. "I forgave you years ago. I think I'm afraid of you. Or perhaps I'm afraid of that Christ who indwells you." "Afraid of Christ?" Archippus sat up, his troubles forgotten, hope surging in his heart. "How can the dead fear life? Or the blind fear light? Or the lost sheep fear the shepherd who comes to carry it home? Oh, Onesimus, if you only knew." "I do know," said Onesimus hurriedly, "and I am still afraid." "But of what?" The slave sat silent. How could he tell Archippus how much he feared that light that would shine on his old sin and force him to confess it and cast it on Christ forever? Far better to carry the guilty burden to the grave than that, and it would no doubt shine on that paltry heap of stolen coins and cut across his life's ambition. Far better remain in bondage to sin eternally than risk his chance of calling himself a free man in this world. He suddenly realized that he was desperately afraid now. Love was very near to him, in the tender colors of the sky, and the breath of the warm summer night, in the strength and the humility of the boy at his side, in the unrecognized presence who dwelt his people. Who would withstand that invasion? And what would be the terrible consequences of yielding? He dared not even consider it, and he rose to his feet in panic. "Come," he said hastily, "let us go home. That way is not for me, Archippus. I have told you before, I could never bring my life and plans into line with that sort of thing, but I am glad it is a comfort to you. You need it. I do not." "You need it desperately," replied Archippus, simply, and then fell silent. Onesimus took his young master's arm and led him over the rough ground to the gate of the court, where Ophia stood looking out over the dark fields, anxiously watching for her son's return. Onesimus bade him his usual respectful good night and returned home. But his mind was in turmoil. That night, what he feared had happened to him, so far as he knew, for the first time. According to the Christian jargon, of which he had heard enough to last him until he died, the risen Christ had drawn near to him and called to him, as surely as he had drawn near to Archippus when he fell under the feet of the mob. But the price he asked was too high, and Onesimus had made his great refusal. Now let him weigh up his assets and live for them alone, for they were all he had. He drew out his bag of coins and went over and stared down at his mother. She was asleep, breathing very rapidly and tossing restlessly. He shook her gently, and she woke with a start. "Mother," he began, sitting down beside her, "do you remember that night when we sat in the doorway at sunset and you told me about my father?" She lifted her white face to his, and a little flicker of fear passed over it, but she answered quietly, "I remember, my son." "Mother, do you remember what else you told me that night?" "Yes, I remember." She shivered and started coughing. "Mother, I want to see that little hoard of coins. I want to count them. The time may be very short now, and I must know what is mine." So he had never guessed. She must tell him. "They were not yours, my son," she said. "They belonged to my mistress. When I turned to Christ, he bid me to put away stealing and restore to every man his goods, so I returned them. How could I do otherwise when he called me to walk in the light?" Onesimus clenched his fist. He was alone and forsaken. They had all gone over to Jesus, and even his own mother had betrayed him. In his fury, he struck out at her in the dark. She fell backwards with a little gasp and started coughing again. Terrible, choking coughing. Thoroughly alarmed and bitterly ashamed, he lit a rush and brought her water and helped her to sit up. And as he did so, he saw that her pillow and gown were spattered with blood. And tomorrow we'll be reading chapter 15. I love you, and I'm praying for you, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.